Hello, this is John and Ben from Sweetspot Safari. Today we're going to talk a bit about tribalism. And you might ask the question, why tribalism? Well, we thought it was highly pertinent and relevant to the whole concept of Sweetspot Safari, because tribalism is a really good example of extremes and polarity. And we're going to go into it in a bit more depth as we go through the discussion. But again, the reasons for that is it feels natural to talk about that first. What we're finding is that it's becoming more and more evident in society. You will find that both political commentators and social commentators talk about it more and more. So that's another reason why we thought it was highly relevant. The other thing is, depending on the circumstances, it can be positive and negative, which again is powerful from the concept of having to find sweet spots, etc. It's also heavily nuanced, and you'll find as we go through these sweet spot topics that we're asking ourselves particularly, and also the listeners, to try and look at it with different lenses, look at it with perspective and context, because that's really powerful. There is, ironically, there's no right and wrong. There are no real extremes, although sometimes, of course, extremes in certain short circumstances can actually serve us. But what we're trying to do is find that spot as well. So really, that's all I wanted to say at the moment about the reasons and the rationale and the raison d'etre for the topic. So really, I'm going to throw it across and we'll go into some more detail.
Yeah, thanks for that, John. I think, thinking about the positives and negatives of tribes, one thing that sticks in my mind is football. And, football is, like many sports, an opportunity for tribes to come together. Usually us versus them context. And I remember going to France '98, which is probably still my, up there with my best holiday. I was only 18 at the time. And following England, there was such energy, being with just different people, that sense of solidarity, both in the grounds and outside of the grounds. And just feeling that belonging is really powerful, and obviously it taps into something of what makes us human. But then I went to Euro 2000 to France and Belgium, and that was pretty dangerous. That was pretty wild, and I think that there was a big kind of fight off, if you like, between Germany and England, and I was in the middle of it to some degree, and I think it wasn't really a rational choice. But I found myself just really reflecting on whether football was the right thing for me to get involved in. And on the plus side, you got the energy and the belonging, but then the downside is I didn't really hate the opposition, and I also didn't want to lose my eye or my life for following an England result, which I had no bearing on the result. It was what it was. And so I just felt myself just really over time, just becoming less enthusiastic with football and being part of that tribe. So that's just one reflection on the ups and downs of, our tribal nature. What about you? Yeah,
I guess before I go into mine, it sounds as though you had a bit of a defining moment there, Ben. It was almost like a aha moment. And I sensed that it was like you hadn't really thought about tribes until that other experience you had in France 2000. So this is quite an important point, because sometimes, and I know you and I have discussed it recently, is we have things creep, incremental change. We don't even realize things are happening. And we don't always notice sometimes that we're becoming part of a tribe unnecessarily, because we were doing all the right things for the right intentions. So I think the points you make there are extremely powerful. So I guess my experience are more in the business world, working with teams, projects, etc., around the world. But what I find is some common themes around tribalism. And if we look at the positives, and you've touched it on already, it fosters collectivism, right? Which is, good for positive outcomes. It can also be a binding force within teams, which is really powerful. And I've experienced that in, some of my operational work and some of my consulting work abroad. And it can also promote a lot of energy. It can sort of feed off of each other, and you can feed off each other's energy, which is really powerful. But of course, as always with these things, you know, sometimes too much of a good thing can also be negative. So you've got to be very conscious and very self-aware about this sort of stuff. But it also can be negative. You know, I've seen it within teams where it can create factionalism. You know, my tribe's more important than your tribe, which again can have and again, it's not always overt. Sometimes it's covert. And you know, experience, sometimes the covert factionalism is probably the worst, the stuff that's not evident. Because that can become sort of degrading. Sometimes what we call in the coaching word catabolic energy, you know, it can start to eat away at you over a period of time. And it can also lead to alienation of certain people, which is never good, you know, especially as we're trying to foster more and more teamwork. So I think what's really important around, you know, tribes is, you know, recognize the positives, but also be aware of the potential negatives. And again, as we've said before, it's heavily nuanced. So somebody's positive can also be somebody else's negative. So for a leader to navigate through this, it can be quite difficult. And that's why a lot of skills required, a lot of active listening, and a lot of self-awareness, which again is another topic we're going to talk about later on in the series. So I know historically, Ben, you've done quite a bit of research into this, and particularly around the genesis of tribalism. So, you know, give us some idea in terms of your thinking and what you've pulled up in your research around tribalism.
So I think fundamentally, we evolved. You know, our emotions are, you know, just humans evolved to be hunter-gatherers. And that's where, you know, depending on who you ask, it's 99% of our evolution. That's what we were. We were in small, close-knit tribes, maybe of 30 or 40 people. We roamed, we foraged. And then over time, we developed into farmers, then industrialists. And you could argue that maybe we're digital nomads now. Yeah. But although these are different eras, we still got the physiology, the psychology of hunter-gatherers, and so that tribal essence is still there. We don't lose it. We might change our circumstances and environments, but ultimately we still got an element of our tribal nature at heart. And I think we, you know, in an individualistic culture, and you've mentioned the trade-offs between individuals and the group, we tend to forget actually we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the group. You know, we're not the strongest, we're not the fastest, we're not the largest, but actually our strength comes in our cooperation. And so actually forming tribes, you know, beating other tribes and collaborating to solve you know, significant problems was part of why we're here. And so I think there's always been this trade-off, really, that we surrender some of our own individual thinking to the group interest. And I think that this, you know, has a different balance over time. And you could argue that actually, as we get more successful, we have more comfort. We start investing in the self as us as individuals, and actually during times of crises where we've got problems to solve, we revert back to the group. Actually, how do we come together and actually solve these shared problems together? And so I think, you know, interestingly, there's you might be familiar with Robert Dunbar, and he has a number of 150, which is, you know, a rough number that actually the number of people that we can know reasonably well, and we have that rough ceiling. But you know, interestingly, we coordinate in societies. You know, we kind of coordinate with other people, the other side of the country who we've never met, and you know, over time we've just basically increased our size of cooperation. And so you could argue, you know, to your point about a team, an organization as a tribe, a society as a tribe. So there's all these different levels of tribes, and you could argue probably in the future we need to think globally as a tribe, but it feels a bit of a far stretch with our current issues. And I think just the important thing really is to mention that tribes can be good and bad, and you've touched on that. Bad tribes can be full of meaning and purpose, and you can have a really good cause, but you can do a lot of damage, fighting that cause. And so I think understanding that there are, good and bad aspects to being tribal. You can solve a lot of problems, but you can cause a lot of problems as well. I think those are the things which really, stick out to me. I don't know if there's anything there that, springs to mind.
I'd like to come back on that magic 150 number. It's quite interesting, actually. I can't remember whether W.L. Gore actually used Dunbar as their origin, but I know W.L. Gore, famous American company that made textiles and all sorts of advanced materials, Gore-Tex being one of them, was that they had a management system that said they never went above a number of about 100 or so in a community or in a factory or so, because they realized once it got above that number, then things became disjointed and disconnected and problems. And I think they found it out partly heuristically as well, but they always tried to come up with clusters around that sort of number, which I think is quite interesting, because you were talking a societal context, which is important, but it's also important in a business context. And I think this is what we're trying to do with the Sweetspot safaris. We're trying to get people to think that, what we see in playing out in society is also playing out in business. And actually, some people say, a bit like work-life balance, home life, work life. Well, in reality, it's all melded these days. It's on a sliding scale. And I think you talked about the digital nomads. The digital world is actually creating that soft barrier, shall we say, between work and the societal side and social and home and everything else. So yeah, really interesting points there, Ben. So I think the next thing is really, how are we seeing tribalism playing out, in the real world now? We're seeing it everywhere in politics. You only have to look at, and I'm only going to mention a couple of countries. I'm not picking them out only because it's recent evidences. Marine Le Pen, nearly got the election in France, from Macron, and she's perceived to be far right. And I'm using the word perceived, of course. Some people might see it a different way. And as we've talked about it, it's the lens you wear. You've got the same going on in Italy at the moment, very recently. It feels like that people are getting more entrenched in their views, and they're also looking for data to support their views. It's quite interesting. There's a famous book, which we've both read, Making the World Add Up by Tim Harford, and he talks about how in the past, people would come up with hypotheses, and then they'd get a data set and they try and prove their hypothesis. And if if the data didn't prove their hypothesis, they went and looked at another hypothesis. The worrying trend seems to be, and Tim raises that and other commentators as well, is that now people are trying to, because they get so entrenched on the hypothesis, they're trying to actually find data to support, almost skew the data to support the hypothesis, which again is potentially a worrying trend and goes against another passionate topic that we'll discuss later on around critical thinking, right, which is really, really important. We're also finding, I think, that people, and again, we're not the only people to talk about it, are conflating issues to get the point of view across. So, they're almost like taking something that's perceived to be really, really good and positive and putting it with something that's less good in order to get their point across. Certain movements are doing that. They're putting, I don't know what term you'd use for it in terms of washing, but basically trying to make things look more acceptable than they would be by putting things together. So there seems to be a bit of, arguably hypocrisy, cynicism, and everything else. And again, we're not there to judge any individual groups. We're just trying to highlight that this potentially is going on. And you as a listener may think that it's not really going on. It's a non-issue, but this is what we see. And again, speak to people that we speak to are seeing that play out. And again, I think just finally, we're seeing things, possibly retrenching back to some of the old ideas and the old values, because it's almost like the bedrock. And you see the politics, certainly in the UK, the polarized politics going on in the UK at the moment, that people keep talking about old values, etc., and going backwards because they feel that that's what's, served them in the past. Now, that may not necessarily be good, right? Some might be good, some might be bad. And this is where this nuance and perspective side of things is, and the blending and trying to find that sweet spot is really, really important. I don't know, what you think about that, Ben,
Well, I think there's more. Yeah, there's just so many different factors at play, and what's clear is, given our circumstances, we can't really go back to the past. But then we shouldn't necessarily get rid of everything which is valuable from the past. And not all progress is good progress. And I think this will be probably one of a topic which will run through quite a few, is what to keep, traditions and rituals, and what things work, and also what do we need to renew and kind of reinvent. And so trying to find that, in politics, a lot of this can be seen through that conservation versus progress lens, and you have tribal identities associated with very future-looking perspectives, and ones which are very retrospective, looking back perspectives, and both of those play a part with who we are and what we need to struggle to find a balance with. And I think that's really just the essence of what we're trying to do here. But I think so. I guess in the back of my mind is that your points seem to suggest is that we are becoming more polarized, perhaps more fixed in our ideologies and perspectives and outlooks. Where do you see this playing out? Because it doesn't seem like it's improving, put it that way. So where next?
Yes. So I think before I try, and I'll use the words try and answer the question in terms of playing out, it's quite interesting when we were talking about going back to potentially old values and stuff. There's a famous pyramid from Maslow, a hierarchy of needs, and in times of great trouble, and we have had trouble recently, we've got a war situation going on, we've had the COVID pandemic, people tend to go back to the basics, which if you look at the Maslow pyramid, was always about, food, water, shelter, etc., before moving into a space where we were sort of more intellectually energized. And at the top of the pyramid, they talk about self-actualization, which basically means that we feel comfortable with ourselves and we can do within reason what we want to do without fear or favor. So I think there is an element of that. In terms of moving forward, I think the position is unclear. I think it's very difficult to try and predict where it's going to end. And I think, to try and do so would probably both dangerous and potentially arrogant. But I think history has shown that eventually when things become too extreme or polar, then something happens, something breaks and something snaps, right? Because it's a bit like the immovable force and the unstoppable object, it's like a piece of cord potentially that has a breaking strain that snaps because there's too much force on it, to use a science analogy. So I think that as a society is something we have to be aware of. I think the only way potentially, and loads of commentators talk about it, social change, systemic change, but is that really going to happen? Because in order to do that, you need a level of real collectivism and some level of sort of common need, common requirement, etc. And ultimately, to your point with the history, we are animals, man the hunter and all this sort of stuff. Are we truly ever going to, and I know society's tried to do that before, to get to a level of collectivism to the point where there is a common need and a common vision and a common value to change things. We've got people like, Elon Musk, who's building his rockets, and Jeff Bezos, who's building his rockets and thinking about going elsewhere. So some commentators may say, is leaving the planet the answer, or is it better to stay here and fix what we've got, particularly with all the environmental challenges? So I think it's a very, very complex and difficult issue. What I would say is I think that the more self-aware people are, the more people are aware of certain levels of difference, which is important, and respect them, and aware of hypocrisy, and think critically by looking at objective data rather than, let's say, conflating issues or just having an opinion based on a single data point. I think what I can say is all those sort of things are potentially damaging, right? The conflation of issues and the lack of critical thinking can probably only cause more harm than good. So I think we need to be, and I think the words, you and I have talked before, that were used before. We need to be more adult and mature. And you do wonder whether society at the moment, with a level of conflict and change, is not as mature as it maybe could be. I don't know whether that answers the question for everybody, but it just hopefully gives some perspective. And I think arguably society needs to grow up.
Yeah, I think that's, and maybe being, surrendering independent thought for your tribal, ideology. That doesn't necessarily feel like it leads to maturity in many cases. So I get that, and I think that your point about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which incidentally, I don't think he actually ever put it into a kind of pyramid. I don't think he ever actually illustrated it quite in that way. I think that was co-opted perhaps, but I think the kind of the basic ideas are right, that we can't self-actualize. We can't evolve and transform as a society or as individuals if we haven't got food to eat, if we haven't got fundamental a society which works effectively. And so I think that there's what a lot of these things are pointing towards are working on our foundation, on our kind of structures, and making sure that we've got a solid platform to build from, both as individuals and as groups. And I think with the climate, with the fallout from the pandemic, with energy problems, with inequality, with mental illness, there's a huge amount of issues which are creating almost like this tribal energy where people want to solve problems. But I think that the more fraught that these become, the more we risk actually fighting other people who are wanting to try and solve the same problems, but going from A to B in a slightly different way. And I think that most of us want similar things. And I think just most of us take slightly different routes. We have slightly different value judgments, and actually realizing that maybe our collective problems require cooperation. And so somehow we need to try and find that common ground, that common understanding, because actually all of these problems are shared problems, and they require a larger degree of cooperation. So I think as our circumstances just to become more critical, I definitely see opportunities for this cycle to be broken. Any thoughts there?
I'd like to pick on the positives. I do think your perception around, quite often we're all looking for a common end, but it's how we get there is slightly different. And I see that to a certain extent with the silent majority. Almost you could say it's the moderate majority in the middle. It's quite often, irrespective if they have a sort of political difference, that you might find that they've got a lot more in common than they actually think they have. It's just that the way they go around it. So I think that's a very solid point. But I'd like to finish before we sign off on sort of a positive point, building right back to your football analogy at the start. I remember earlier this year, I'm a big Liverpool football fan, and we were watching a football game, and Cristiano Ronaldo, for people who understand football, Man United, Liverpool are arch rivals, right? Had lost a baby son in very, very tragic circumstances. And at the start of the game, all the Liverpool fans, they had a minute's silence, and they all had shirts wearing the number 7, which was his number 7, right? To recognize the fact that he'd lost that son. Now, if fierce football rivals can do that in a moment of humankind, I think we have to have faith in human nature. So I think that's a real positive thing. So just finishing off, go ahead.
I think just it's just a really powerful point that and it just illustrates that the beauty of human nature, that actually we quite often misjudge people, and we misjudge groups. We tend to overgeneralize and see people and groups through negative lenses sometimes. But I think just accepting that being tribal is part of who we are. And we tend to think of very kind of black or white terms, that all tribalism is bad, and no tribalism is good. But that's not who we are. And to your point earlier on about trying to find nuance, and I guess, you know, trying to find a sweet spot here, is that if tribes are who, you know, if being parts of tribes are who we are, let's try and make these healthy tribes. Let's try and make these tribes have a purpose, which isn't defeating another tribe, is actually solving problems, and solving problems together, which actually impact everybody in a positive way. So I think there's an opportunity for us to, you know, come out of our internet tribes, if you like, our bubbles on social media, and think about being tribal on a local level, and actually coming together in communities and solving local issues, which connect maybe to Maslow's lower rung needs, which are, you know, security and food and safety and you know, housing. And actually, I just think that's just, you know, a really important thing to think about, that, you know, tribes can and are part of who we are and can be put to good use.
Yeah, great. I mean, that's finishing on a great point there. So, you know, as we move on, we'd like to just mention a few of the potential future topics, which we're still working through at the moment, just to give you a flavour for what we could be doing. And by the way, this is not an exhaustive list. So, you know, one of the things we want to talk on, which sort of follows a bit on from tribalism, we may not do it next one, we may wait a bit, is individualism versus collectivism. You know, emotional intelligence versus IQ, for instance. You know, that's always a hot topic of debate. You know, sort of the like share social media culture we seem to have at the moment versus having deeper thought or critical thinking. You know, self-awareness versus more closed thinking. And they're just a few examples. You know, it's not an exhaustive list, but we just wanted to sort of whet your appetite for future topics, and hopefully you'll find those interesting, and hopefully you found today's discussion interesting. So thank you again for listening. So that's thanks from me, and
yeah, been a pleasure. Thanks, John. Thanks all.